Hello, and welcome to my first of 3 lessons on Augustine. The first having to do with Augustine's conflicts with Pelagius. All of these big things that Augustine writes about came about as a result of conflicts. And the first one has to do with this conflict of Pelagius. Now Augustine, these notes, by the way, aren't, they're going to match up, the blanks will match up, but I can't project the notes, and so you're going to need to follow along closely and fill in blanks. And I'll write additional things as well that you can write if you'd like. So we have Augustine on one side of this debate, and then on the other side we have Pelagius. Now, Augustine, remember, is in Hippo, which is in North Africa, and Pelagius is in Britain. So these people lived far apart, but they wrote back and forth, and they also had followers and other people involved in the dispute. So again, Augustine, he's bishop in North Africa, and Pelagius is kind of a monk ascetic teacher in Britain. So Augustine obviously had more power and authority since he's a bishop than this teacher in Britain. And the issue has to do with how does one, what is really a Christian? What really saves you? And it comes about as Pelagius, when he visits the mainland Europe, coming from Britain, if you don't know, is an island, and when he comes to the mainland Europe, he's appalled and upset at the lax state of Christianity. Remember that once Christianity is legalized, everyone had to become a Christian. And so think about it as if all of a sudden tomorrow President Obama and the Congress and the Supreme Court decided that our country was supposed to be Christian, or even just Rhode Island was supposed to be Christian. And imagine if all of a sudden Barrington High School or East Providence High School was to be a Christian high school. And in the course of 10, 20, 50 years was meant to be transformed to something like BCA. BCA, I think, has room for improvement in terms of being a Christian school. But imagine that. You can imagine that some people would say they're Christian, but they wouldn't really be. Some teachers would say they're Christian, but they really wouldn't be. Some people making big decisions in school boards and principals would say they're Christian, but they wouldn't really be. And so for Pelagius, what saved you, what saved people, he talked about how God gave people commands. God gave us commands, and he also gave us an example in Jesus Christ. In Matthew 5:48, Jesus says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And as Pelagius read that, he said, why on earth would Jesus tell us to be perfect like God is perfect if we're not supposed to be perfect? So Pelagius taught that we are saved by doing what is right, by obeying the commands of God, and by following the example of Jesus. And he said that we're free to choose, that we have free will, and we can choose whether we follow God's commands or not. Augustine said this idea that we're saved by our works, by our good deeds, is against the Christian gospel. And so he started looking in the different books of the Bible, particularly in Paul's writings and elsewhere, and he developed some ideas that are really influential in Christianity today, especially in some types of Christianity in different churches. The first thing he talked about how we are saved by grace. This is towards the bottom of this section. It says, "Thus, for Augustine, humanity's salvation is totally by grace." God gives us what we can't earn. God gives us what we can't earn so that we can be with him forever. In fact, Augustine wrestles with this whole free will thing. He writes a book called On Grace and Free Will, in which he talks about how we actually, although we have free will in one sense, we are slaves to sin. we have what's called is the sin nature inside of us. And if you've ever heard somebody talk about a sin nature, they're talking about the Bible using Augustine terms. Again, he's so influential. So what is the sin nature? This idea we're slaves to sin. We have what's called, there's original sin. Original sin is that we as humans inherit the sin of our ancestors Adam and Eve. That's the original sin. It's the sin out of Adam and Eve that's passed down to all people. In other words, sin is in our DNA. We're born sinners. And the idea, therefore, is that of total depravity is that there's not one part of us that's good. Total depravity means that we're so filled with this sin nature, and it's in every part of us, our mind, our spirit, our soul, our heart, our physical being, that we, in a sense, lose our free will. We are slaves to sin, and we won't choose to follow God no matter what, unless God does something in our hearts. Unless God gives us the grace to choose Him, we won't choose Him. So total depravity is all of us, 100% of us is sinful. There's no part of us that isn't against God. We can't choose God. We won't choose God. We won't choose to follow God unless God does something for us. And for Augustine, God has done something for us. Because God knew that nobody would choose to follow Him, He, through His grace, predestined those who would follow Him, those whom He would give the grace to follow Him. God saves people by choosing to give them grace. As it says in Ephesians 4, by grace you have been saved through faith. And not of yourselves, it is a gift from God. God gave the grace. And God chose who to give grace even before He made the world. That's why it's called predestination. Before God made anything, He chose who would follow Him. God predestined those to whom He'd give grace. Now I'm going to write the rest of these notes up top so that it's not cut off. But the people that got the grace are called the elect. So the elect are the ones chosen by God to receive grace. And the other group is called the reprobate. the reprobate. R-E-P-R-O-B-A-T-E. Those not chosen by God, who don't receive the grace and who don't follow him. For Augustine, therefore, baptism, lastly, the importance of baptism, that last section on this notes here. For Augustine, baptism is so important, and he really is the one who makes infant baptism the standard practice. Because if we're born with sin, then we can die as sinners at any point. And so for Augustine, baptism was given by God to wash us of our original sin. And so he is the one who really sets in place the practice of infant baptism. And for 1,000 years, every church really baptized people as infants. That was the common practice. And so today, many churches baptize infants partly because of Augustine's thinking. Baptism washes away original sin. And is the first step in grace. The first step in receiving God's grace. So Augustine won this debate, and ever since Augustine, this has been waves people have talked. They've talked about how we have this sin nature, and we can't save ourselves. We're not saved by good works. We're saved by God's grace. And how we are totally sinful. We inherit Adam and Eve's sin. And God gives us, many churches, not all, we'll talk about this later, that's debated, talk about how God chooses us first. We don't choose him first. He chooses us and gives us the grace to follow him. And those chosen by God are the elect. And those not chosen are the reprobate. And how baptism is important in this because baptism is the first step in receiving God's grace. And that's why infants are to be baptized. If you disagree with Augustine, tell me why in class. This is really important stuff to think about. Do we choose to follow God or does he choose us? If we do have this sin nature, then is baptism for infants the only way and the right way? Think about those things and let's have a great discussion in class. Bye-bye.